Whether attributable to divine will, extraordinary luck, or some natural power which modern science is yet to fathom, cases of apparent prophecy and clairvoyance recur with surprising frequency throughout Canadian history. In this compilation, we will revisit several such stories previously published on this channel. First, we will take a look at cases of clairvoyance on the Canadian frontier, in which Dene natives apparently gifted with second sight were able to watch distant events unfold while they slept, as if by astral projection. Next, we will revisit 3 prophecies born out of the Beaver Wars, the 17th century conflict between French-Canadian colonists and their native allies and the powerful Iroquois Confederacy, including Jesuit martyr Father Jean de Brebeuf's chilling vision portending the genocide of the Huron nation, and the foresight of Sister Catherine de Saint-Augustin and 2 Algonquin women, who appear to have received divine warnings of the 1663 Charlevoix Earthquake. After that, we will return to old Eastern Canadian tales of Forerunners, unsolicited warnings of impending disaster, said to occur in the maritime provinces of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, as well as in the more northerly province of Newfoundland. Next, we will return to 2 eerie premonitions reported by Railwaymen, including the story of the Medicine Hat Ghost Train, a sort of locomotive doppelganger portending a deadly train collision, and the tale of a CP rail engineer whose life was saved twice by the warnings of what seemed to have been a sort of guardian angel. Finally, we will return to an old video which the YouTube algorithm seems to have buried, which covers spooky lithic omens which are said to appear from time to time in an unusual location in southern Alberta. Maritime Forerunner stories with happy endings. Real-life examples of the mysterious psychic bond which seems to exist between certain close friends and family members. Cases of dreams that later came true. And cases of well-known clairvoyance in the province of Ontario. Enjoy. Ever since the 18th century Enlightenment, Western thinking has been dominated by rationalism, the idea that our perception of truth ought to be defined by reason and the scientific method, as opposed to tradition or divine revelation. This way of thinking has benefited mankind enormously, in a material sense at least, having paved the way for technological advancements which have allowed us to work more efficiently, explore the world and beyond, and enjoy a better quality of life than our ancestors could even dream of. For all the good it has done us, rationalism is not without its shortcomings. The idea that we can come to a complete understanding of reality through reason alone hinges upon the assumption that we are equipped with the tools necessary to perceive everything that is real. But just as an insect lacks the equipment to comprehend things like music, math, and spoken language, perhaps we human beings lack the capacity to comprehend all reality through the narrow prisms of reason and our 5 senses through which we view the world. In other words, there are probably some facets of reality which we may never be able to fully understand or explain through reason alone. One mystery which defies rational explanation is a phenomenon called second sight, a supposed extrasensory perception or sixth sense. People endowed with second sight are said to have the ability to receive information, usually through dreams or visions, of distant or future events. In many cases, they have no control over these visions, which come upon them unexpectedly. These visions are often distressing, as the information they contain frequently involves the death of someone known to the seer. It has been suggested that there is a higher prevalence of second sight among members of certain ethnic groups. This gift is most often associated with the Gaels of the Scottish Highlands, who call it Da Xiao Loch, or 2 sights. It is also known throughout the rest of Scotland, as well as in Ireland, Wales, and Cornwall, regions of the British Isles with high populations of ethnic Celts. Another ethnic group, which may be similarly blessed with this gift of prophecy, are the Dene of northern Canada. United by ancient blood ties and a common language family, the Dene are a First Nations ethnic group comprised of roughly 21 different tribes, whose ancestors are believed to have migrated from Siberia via an ancient bridge of land and ice about 12,000 years ago. Few parapsychologists, as students of extrasensory perception are known, have explored a potential connection between second sight and the Dene people. Judging from a handful of stories from Canada's northern frontier, however, perhaps they ought to. One of the first Northerners to write about second sight among the Dene was a Canadian frontiersman named Poole Field, a former Northwest Mounted Police officer who served during the Klondike Gold Rush. In the early 1900s, Poole Field established a trading post in southeastern Yukon at the confluence of the Pelly and Ross rivers, from which he sold goods to the local Dene in exchange for furs. In the spring of 1908, Field's store was visited for the first time by a Kaska Dene shaman named Little Doctor, who was famed throughout the region for his gift of prophecy. At the time of Little Doctor's arrival, Poole Field's partner was missing. He had taken his steamboat downriver to Dawson City in order to purchase fresh supplies, but had failed to return on schedule. Many of the native trappers who relied on Field's goods were beginning to get anxious, and at their insistence, Field gave Little Doctor some tobacco as a gift and asked him to see what had become of his partner. Little Doctor proceeded to have a number of dreams, by which he predicted the arrival of Field's partner and the cause of his delay. Although he had never seen a steamboat before, he was also able to describe the missing craft in perfect detail, down to the passengers aboard and the amount of freight being hauled. His predictions proved to be perfectly accurate. When Field asked the medicine man how he came by the information, Little Doctor explained that, while he slept, his spirit had left his body and traveled downriver, allowing him to see the steamer with his own eyes. Another incident of second sight on the Canadian frontier took place in the winter of 1922 at Fort Fitzgerald in northeastern Alberta. One morning, while she was thawing out a frozen loaf of bread over her cast-iron oven, Jean Godsell, the wife of a prominent fur trader, was approached by the fort's interpreter, a Chippewayan Dene man named John James Daniels. The native cryptically informed the woman that before noon that day, they would be visited by two unfortunate Indians who had run into bad luck in the subarctic wilderness. He neglected to offer any explanation as to how he came by this troubling news. Sure enough, shortly before the sun reached its zenith, Mrs. Godsell was approached by an RCMP constable who asked if she would like to accompany him on a hike to the shores of nearby Slave Lake to greet some approaching Indians he had spotted. Mystified, the woman slipped on her parka and snowshoes and accompanied the Mountie to the riverbank. There, in the distance, she saw the serpentine figure of a dog team heading towards them, mushing over the frozen river ice. As the natives neared the fort, it became clear that something was terribly amiss. The dog team had no driver. Suddenly, to her horror, Mrs. Godsell made out two tiny fur-clad figures struggling through the snow at opposite ends of the train. She recognized them as the young daughters of a local Chippewayan chief. The two girls had accompanied their father on a trapping venture earlier that fall. The load strapped to the sled was their father's frozen corpse. Astounded, the fur trader's wife looked to John James Daniels, who shrugged his shoulders and mumbled that he had seen this exact scene in a dream the previous night. Another case of Dene clairvoyance took place in the summer of 1945 at the Horse Lake First Nations Reserve northwest of Grande Prairie, Alberta. One night, a Beaver Dene widow dreamt that she was in a canoe on a river in the middle of the wilderness. The man paddling the canoe was a guide whom her late husband had known in life. Guiding the paddler was the ghost of her husband, who had drowned in the Wapiti River many years earlier. After a day on the river and a night under the stars, her husband's spirit led her to a particular section of riverbank. There, near the shore, sprawled a human corpse. The woman's husband then took her to the opposite shore, where another body lay entangled in a pile of driftwood. The dream reminded the woman of an incident which took place about a month earlier, near the headwaters of the Wapiti River in the British Columbian Rockies. Two Dene trappers named Archie Belcourt and Josie Latan had been tasked with guiding a survey party through the area. While attempting to cross the Wapiti on horseback, they were swept from their mounts by the spring current. Although the survey party searched for their remains, no trace of their bodies could be found. The Beaver woman suspected that the spirit of her late husband had led her to the bodies of Belcourt and Latan. After securing the assistance of the paddler from her dream, she headed to the site of the drowning and paddled downriver. She followed the instructions she received in her dream, spending a day on the river and a night under the stars. She and her companion continued down the river the following morning and paddled for most of the day. Around dusk, The Indian woman suddenly exclaimed, "This is the place I saw in my dream." The party headed over to the shore, where they found a skeleton. Although the wolves had been there first, the party was able to identify the body as Belcourt's from a large metal belt buckle they found nearby. Some distance downstream, on the opposite side of the river, they found the half-submerged body of Josie Latan wedged between two logs, just like in the Indian woman's dream. From the journals of Robert Campbell, a 19th century explorer whose Dene guide foresaw the events that would take place during a future journey up the Pelly River, to the tale of Shonkelli, a Dene medicine man from Fort Churchill, Manitoba, who correctly predicted that a priest aboard an inbound supply ship had drowned in Hudson Bay. Northern Canadian literature is replete with stories affirming the uncanny clairvoyance with which many Dene seem to be endowed. Whether attributable to outrageous coincidence or to some mysterious genetic trait, the mechanism of which eludes our understanding, these incidents bear testament to the mantle of mystery and romance that enshrouds the land of the midnight sun, and to the ancient notion, so foreign to the rationalistic philosophy that dominates modern thought, that there might be more to reality than meets the eye. In the summer of 1843, a tough Scottish Hudson's Bay Company explorer named Robert Campbell decided to lead an exploratory expedition down the Pelly River in southeastern Yukon, one of the many battles comprising his lifelong quest to outcompete Russian fur traders in the Pacific Northwest. Campbell described this voyage in his journal, and included an interesting anecdote involving a fascinating and mysterious aspect of Dene Indian culture. In his entry for June 10, 1843, Campbell wrote, quote, "A short digression here may not be out of place, and may be of some interest. All Indians I have ever met believe that certain highly favored individuals can, by means of conjuring, look into the future, and foretell events that are to happen. And strange to say, I have known several instances in which the predictions of the conjurer have come true, or very nearly so. In the case I am about to mention, it will be seen how singularly correct the divination was. Our Indians wanted to find out what luck was to attend us on our voyage of discovery, and unknown to me, got one of their number, named Gauche, one of my hunters for many years, and an adept in most things, who was a famous expert, and implicitly believed in by the others, to conjure for them the evening before we started. He did so, and told what was going to happen on the trip. He described our course, stated that at a certain time we would meet 2 Indians on the right bank of the river. Afterwards we would meet a family of Indians with whom we would smoke and eat. That we would kill plenty small but no large game, although we would see plenty on the mountain slopes along the river, and many minor events he foretold, ending up by saying that at the junction of 2 big rivers we would fall in with many Indians, and talk with them much. After that he could not see us going any further, but that there was no blood visible, meaning that the strangers did not quarrel with us. How close Gauche came to the reality will presently be shown. My attention was drawn to the conjuring which had taken place by hearing the remark constantly made, "That's what Gauche said," when anything occurred which appeared to the Indians to corroborate Gauche's predictions. Unquote. Campbell went on to chronicle the voyage, and sure enough, each of Gauche's predictions were fulfilled. When the sunburnt, mosquito-bitten officers of the Northwest Mounted Police, Canada's first Mounties, rode into Writing on Stone in the fall of 1874, they were disheartened, saddle-weary, and lost. The previous fall, they had first come together as a unit in Fort Dufferin, Manitoba. That summer, after months of training, they rode out west, bound for the notorious Fort Whoop-Up, determined to bring law and order to the Canadian Wild West. Unfortunately, some of the Métis guides they hired had a less than complete knowledge of the Western Territories' geography. By early fall, the Mounties found themselves straddling the Boundary Commission Trail on the Canadian-American border, with no idea where they were in relation to their destination. The force's assistant commissioner, James McLeod, and a handful of officers rode south to Fort Benton, Montana, in the hopes that they might find some directions. They found better. 2 of the town's most prominent businessmen hosted the Mounties. During dinner, the Montanian merchants suggested that McLeod and company hire a short, bow-legged Scots Blackfoot frontiersman named Jerry Potts as their guide. despite learning that the unimposing mustachioed plainsman was a man of few words who had an enormous appetite for whiskey, the commodity which they hoped to eliminate from the Canadian plains, the Mounties took their suggestion and hired Jerry Potts as their chief scout. They couldn't have been happier with their decision. Jerry Potts returned with MacLeod to Riding on Stone, took up a position at the head of the column, and led the bedraggled Mounties northwest over prairies and coulees. Said Mountie Sam Steele of the quiet, mysterious guide, quote, "He never talked with others when he was at work. He would ride on ahead by himself, keeping his mind fixed on the mysterious business of finding the way. He was never able to give any clear explanation of his method. Some mysterious power, perhaps a heritage from his Indian ancestors, was at work," unquote. In no time, Potts led the mounted policemen to Fort Whoop-Up on the banks of the Old Man River. Shortly thereafter, he led them upriver to the location at which they would build Fort MacLeod, their first permanent headquarters. Jerry Potts remained in the Mounties' employ, performing the functions of scout and interpreter. Throughout his tenure, he had several opportunities to demonstrate his supernatural sense of direction. Perhaps the most dramatic of these took place in the winter of early 1875, when he led his respective Mountie charges through blinding blizzards on 2 separate occasions, during one of which he was rendered snowblind. Said Sam Steele of his scouting ability, quote, "He possessed an uncanny sense of locality and direction. Others could guide travelers through country they had visited before, but this man could take a party from place to place by the quickest route, through country altogether unknown to him, without compass and without sight of the stars," unquote. In 1954, Jean Godsell, the wife of a prominent Canadian fur trader and historian, wrote an article entitled The Moccasin Telegraph, in which she described a mysterious case of Indian clairvoyance which took place at Fort Churchill, in northern Manitoba, in the early 1900s. Ever since the construction of the enormous Prince of Wales fort in 1717, the Fort Churchill area, situated at the mouth of the Churchill River, had served as one of the Hudson's Bay Company's 2 great ports, which lay, as one disgruntled HBC employee put it, quote, "asleep by the frozen sea," unquote. The sprawling chain of HBC fur trading outposts, which extended from Hudson Bay west and north across the continent, relied on huge biannual shipments of goods from England, which were unloaded at the bayside forts and transported to their respective destinations by York boat and canoe. According to Jean Godsell, sometime in the early 1900s, one of these ships was long overdue, causing Fort Churchill's factor, a fur trader named Ashton Alston, considerable anxiety. Desperate to learn any news regarding the fate of the missing ship, Alston hired a visiting medicine man named Shonkelli, who was famed throughout the region for his gift of prophecy, to employ the arcane arts in which he was versed in the acquisition of such news. Accepting a pile of tobacco plugs as payment, the shaman retreated to his teepee, where he went into a trance. He returned at sundown and declared that the ship would arrive the following day. It was delayed, he maintained, because her crew had decided to rescue a party whose own ship had foundered in the ice-choked waters of Hudson Strait. After rescuing these men, the company men suffered a tragedy of their own. One of their members, a man who wore clothes like a woman, died and was buried at sea. The following day, the HBC ship indeed arrived at Fort Churchill, just as the old man had predicted. While heading through the Hudson Strait, the crew had spotted some men marooned on an ice floe. They rescued the unfortunates, but were themselves trapped by heavy pack ice in the process. When they finally managed to liberate themselves from their icy prison, one of their members fell overboard and drowned. This man was a black-robed priest, bound for the mission at Chesterfield Inlet, in what is now Nunavut. Shonkelli's prediction, it seemed, was fulfilled. Despite its relative tranquility, Canadian history is marred by a 60-year spell of terrible violence and unspeakable cruelty, rivaling the goriest chapters of its southern counterpart. A time of massacre, torture, and genocide. The crimson pages on which this harrowing drama is chronicled appear in the annals of the Ancien regime, set in a time when the fleur-de-lis flew over the Laurentian Valley, and King Louis XIV sat on the throne of France. In this age of extremes, when aristocratic extravagance crossed swords with Puritan austerity, and Baroque refinement linked arms with medieval brutality, the Canadian wilderness was embroiled in a bitter series of conflicts, known collectively as the Beaver Wars. which pitted Catholic New France and its native allies against Protestant New England, New Netherland, and the Iroquois Confederacy. The opening scene of this historical tragedy begins in the mid-1600s, when the North Woods were a powder keg, on a collision course with the open flame of war. At that time, the French controlled the valley of the St. Lawrence River, the settlements of Quebec, Trois-Rivières, and Ville-Marie, now Montreal, forming a colony known as New France. In the frontier beyond these settlements, in the forests north of the St. Lawrence and the eastern shores of the Great Lakes, French Jesuit missionaries, members of a Catholic religious order called the Society of Jesus, had established missions among the allied Huron, Algonquians, and Montagnais, where they worked tirelessly to convert the natives to the Catholic faith. South of the St. Lawrence, in the valley of the Hudson River, the Dutch had established the strongholds of Fort Orange and New Amsterdam, now Albany and New York City, out of which they traded with the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk. And to the east, along the Atlantic coast, the English held a scattering of Protestant colonies, the settlements of Maine, Plymouth, Connecticut, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, forming a loose agglomerate known as New England. In their bids for furs, converts, and religious liberty, these European rivals had ensconced themselves in the midst of an ancient conflict that had raged since at least the days of Samuel de Champlain, a ferocious rivalry between the Iroquois Confederacy and the northerly Huron and Algonquians. Fought in part over prime trapping territory, beaver pelts being valuable commodities for which the French, English, and Dutch were eager to trade, this violent competition produced some of the most horrific atrocities to ever be committed on North American soil. Following a successful raid on an enemy convoy or village, native victors on both sides of the St. Lawrence carried any men, women, and children they managed to capture back to their own country. With the exceptions of those who were killed outright or selected for adoption into the tribe, the prisoners were tortured to death and cannibalized in gruesome rituals intended to appease both the heathen gods of the victors and the ghosts of their departed kinsmen. Although the natives took the greatest delight in tormenting and eating vanquished enemy warriors, neither women nor children were spared the blades, brands, and red-hot tomahawks of the triumphant torturers. The French themselves became embroiled in this blood feud in the early 1640s, when Iroquois war parties began to prowl the Richelieu River and the southern shores of the St. Lawrence, killing or capturing any Gallic hunter, laborer, or missionary who fell into their clutches. Though terrifying to the settlers of New France, the predations of these painted invaders from the south were initially small and scattered affairs, akin to wolves preying on lone sheep who ventured too far from their flock. In those early days of the Beaver Wars, however, one Jesuit missionary, a devout Norman priest named Jean de Brebeuf, claimed to have received a divine vision indicating that the war with the Iroquois would bring unprecedented destruction to Huronia, the land of the Huron, bounded by Lakes Huron, Ontario, and Simcoe, where the Jesuits had established a mission. In February 1641, while returning to Huronia after an unsuccessful mission in the country of the neighboring neutral nation, Brebeuf left his campsite at night to pray in the woods. There, under the stars, he saw a vision of a huge cross in the sky, approaching from the southeast, the land of the Iroquois. The following day, he described his miraculous experience to his traveling companion, Father Pierre-Joseph-Marie Chaumonot, interpreting it as a sign of impending martyrdom. When Chaumonot asked him whether the cross was large, he replied, "Yes, large enough to crucify us all." The year 1649 marked the 10th anniversary of the Jesuits' mission in Huron country. The seat of the mission was Sainte Marie among the Huron, the oldest European settlement in what is now the province of Ontario, established by Jean de Brebeuf and his fellow priest, Father Jérôme Lalemant, in 1639. This fortified community was situated near what is now Midland, Ontario, on the southern shores of Georgian Bay. Nearby were a number of Huron villages, which the Jesuits had renamed after Catholic saints. To the east lay the settlements of Saint Louis and Saint Ignace. To the southwest was the village of Ossossané, where the Jesuits had concentrated their early efforts. Far to the southeast, near Lake Simcoe, was Saint Jean Baptiste. And in the heart of Huronia, about 15 miles southeast of Sainte Marie, was the fortified Huron capital of Tia-Naustayé, which the Jesuits called Saint Joseph. It was at the latter settlement that the simmering conflict between the Huron and the Iroquois came to a boil. In the spring of 1648, Dutch traders at Fort Orange sold about 400 arquebuses, or matchlock muskets, to their Mohawk trading partners. Armed with these powerful new weapons, 1,000 Mohawk braves left their ancestral haunts in the forests of upstate New York to deal a death blow to their Huron enemies on the eastern shores of the Great Lake that bears their name. While the Iroquois were on the warpath, a huge party of Huron warriors unwisely set out west to trade with the French at Trois-Rivières, leaving their villages undefended. Aware of this intelligence, the Iroquois decided to launch an assault on the great Huron capital. On the 4th of July, 1648, 1,000 Iroquois war cries erupted from the forest outside Teanaustayaé, in the chapel of which Jesuit Father Antoine Daniel was saying Mass. Knowing that martyrdom awaited him and his native flock, Daniel hastily baptized his congregation with water droplets flung from his handkerchief. That accomplished, he ordered his catechumens to flee, while he himself, still clad in his priestly vestments, went out to greet the besiegers. After recovering from their astonishment at the priest's bold actions and glorious attire, the Iroquois riddled him with arrows and lead. They then proceeded to massacre the town's defenseless inhabitants. Before returning to their own country with the women and children they had captured, they set the town on fire and consigned the body of Antoine Daniel to the flames of his own chapel. The Iroquois returned to Huronia in 1649, 1 year after Daniel's death, and destroyed the ragged remains of the Huron nation in a single devastating offensive. They began their assault with an attack on the mission of Saint Louis, just east of Sainte Marie among the Huron. Those whom they did not kill immediately were captured and carried off to the easterly settlement of Saint Ignace, where they were ritually tortured to death. Among the slain were Jean de Brebeuf and Gabriel Lalemant, whose gruesome fates fulfilled Brebeuf's pretentious prophecy of 8 years prior in appalling fashion. Brebeuf's martyrdom, which we covered in horrific detail in a previous piece, consisted of a series of brutal tortures, ending with the excision of the priest's living heart. Jesuit Christophe Regnault, who learned the details of Brebeuf's final moments from wounded Huron warriors who had escaped their captors and sought refuge in his cabin, wrote that one of the Iroquois, seeing that the good father would soon die, made an opening in the upper part of his chest and tore out his heart, which he roasted and ate. Others came to drink his blood, still warm, which they drank with both hands, saying that Father de Brebeuf had been very courageous to endure as much pain as they had given him, and that by drinking his blood, they would become courageous like him. Although the Iroquois predations of 1662 were not as incessant as they had been the previous year, leaving the colonists of New France to till their fields in relative peace, the Gallic settlers were beleaguered by harassments of another kind, celestial marvels which they interpreted as portents of imminent disaster. The colonists interpreted these mysterious aerial phenomena, which the modern reader can tentatively identify as the aurora borealis, a meteor, and sundogs, respectively, as heavenly signs of impending disaster. Their suspicions were verified when, on February 5, 1663, at about 5:30 in the evening, a tremendous earthquake ripped through the Laurentian Valley. According to Jérôme Lalemant, this upheaval was predicted by 2 young Algonquin women. The first was a 16-year-old girl named Catherine, who had spontaneously recovered from a grave illness earlier that winter. The Jesuit attributed her miraculous improvement to her extraordinary trust in the cross of Christ. On the night before the earthquake, Catherine had a dream in which she and 2 other Algonquin girls climbed a staircase to heaven. At the top was a beautiful church in which Jesus appeared with his Blessed Mother. The Virgin Mary told the girls that the earth would soon be shaken, trees would strike against one another, and rocks would be shattered, to the general consternation of all the people. Terrified that she might have been visited by a demon, the girl described her vision to a priest early the next morning. On the evening of the same day, Lalemant wrote, a short time before the earthquake began, she shouted in a transport of excitement, and as if wrought upon by a powerful influence, she said to her relatives, "It is coming soon," and she afterward had the same presentiments before each of the earthquake shocks. The second Algonquin woman to prophesy the earthquake was a 26-year-old wife whom Lalemant described as very innocent, simple, and sincere. Her startling premonitions were witnessed by her husband and parents, and later investigated by local priests. The following is the woman's testimony, translated from Algonquin to French to English. On the night between the 4th and 5th of February 1663, being fully awake and in full possession of my senses, while in a sitting posture, I heard a voice, distinct and intelligible, which said to me, "Strange things are to happen today. The earth will tremble." Thereupon I was seized with a great fear, seeing no one from which those words could have come. Filled with alarm, I endeavored with considerable difficulty to go to sleep, and when day broke I told my husband, Joseph en Nantucket, quite in private, what had happened to me. As, however, he rebuffed me, saying that I was lying and wished to impose upon him, I said nothing further. At about 9 or 10 o'clock on the same day, on my way to the woods to gather firewood, I had scarcely entered the forest when the same voice made itself heard, saying the same thing, and in the same manner as on the night before. My alarm was much greater, as I was entirely alone, so I looked all around to see if I could catch sight of anyone, but no person was to be seen. Accordingly, I gathered a load of firewood and went home, meeting my sister on the way, as she was coming to help me, and I told her what had just occurred. She at once took the lead and, re-entering the cabin before me, repeated my experience to my father and mother. But as it was all very extraordinary, they merely heard it without giving it any especial thought. There the matter rested until 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening of the same day, when an earthquake occurred, and they recognized by experience that what they had heard me say in the forenoon was only too true. A third woman to foretell the earthquake was the aforementioned Sister Catherine de Saint-Augustin, the pious 31-year-old nun who worked in Quebec's Hotel Dieu, who was tending to the ailing Barbe Pellet. On the night before the earthquake, Sister Catherine had a vision in which 4 demons crouched at the 4 corners of Quebec and shook the earth with terrible violence, as if it were a carpet, with the obvious intention of destroying the stone city perched atop it. The efforts of these devils were thwarted by a beautiful and majestic figure who appeared in their midst, who restrained them when they were on the point of reducing the city to rubble. The so-called Charlevoix Earthquake of February 5th, 1663, is believed to have measured a whopping 7.9 on the Richter scale, making it the 5th largest earthquake in Canadian history. Writers of the day noted that it caused terrain-altering landslides, rent stone walls, and opened deep chasms in the earth. The seismic shock waves caused the trees in the forest to slam into each other with tremendous violence, prompting the natives to fire their guns into the air, hoping to drive away whatever passing spirits they believed were causing the tumult. The water of the St. Lawrence was so churned up by the commotion that it became a muddy sludge unfit to drink for several weeks. Violent as it was, the earthquake failed to claim 1 human life in the Laurentian Valley, which the colonists attributed to divine providence. According to Jérôme Lalemant, the natural disaster was attended by a variety of unexplained phenomena. Besides the roaring which constantly preceded and accompanied the earthquake, he wrote, "We saw specters and fiery phantoms bearing torches in their hands. Pikes and lances of fire were seen, waving in the air, and burning brands darted down on our houses, without, however, doing further injury than to spread alarm wherever they were seen. There was even heard what sounded like plaintive and feeble voices in lamentation during the silence of the night, while porpoises were heard crying aloud before the town of Trois-Rivières, a very unusual occurrence, and filling the air with a pitiful bellowing." Marie de l'Incarnation verified Lalemant's startling claims in a letter to her son, written on August 20th, 1663, adding that infernal voices could be heard on the air, encouraging each other to wreak greater mischief. "We saw fires, torches, and flaming globes," she wrote, "which sometimes fell to the earth and sometimes dissolved in air. A man of fire was seen, with flames pouring from his mouth. Terrible specters were also seen, and it was easy to believe that on this occasion, demons had joined with the earthquakes to increase the fear that agitated nature would cause us." Later in her letter, the nun detailed a disturbing account of a trio of young men who went into the woods to sell brandy to the natives in defiance of the invectives of the church. One of the three, who departed from his comrades in search of some necessity, came face to face with a hideous spectre, whose appearance nearly frightened him to death. When he returned to his comrades and told them of his experience, they began to mock him. "There's nothing here to laugh about," he snapped. "We are selling drinks to the natives in defiance of the church, and God wants to punish us for our disobedience." Humbled by these sobering words, the young men quit their enterprise and returned to their cabin. That evening, an aftershock of the earthquake ripped through their encampment, and the three men barely managed to flee their cabin before it was devoured by the earth. The December 1962 issue of the magazine Fate, one of the many editions of the publication, which can be found in the archives of the late great Fortean researcher Gary Mangiacopra, contains a fascinating article written by Gus Cazzola of Union City, New Jersey. In this piece, Cazzola describes a strange phenomenon unique to his in-laws, the DeStefano family, who hailed from the New Jersey town of West New York. Cazzola was introduced to this weird familial quirk on March 17, 1958, when he and his wife's family were gathered around the DeStefano television set. Suddenly, at 4:00 p.m., Cazzola wrote, a brief flash cut through the crowded room. I blinked frantically to regain my sight. The television was black. Obviously a tube had blown. My in-laws, however, didn't take it so lightly. My father-in-law turned a ghoulish white and abruptly left the room. The kids gaped in horror at the set and ran outside. Even my wife gripped my arm a little harder. "What's going on?" I asked innocently. My wife shook her head mutely and uttered a strained laugh. Shortly thereafter, we received word that my wife's grandmother, Mrs. Mary DeStefano, had died at about 1 o'clock, 3 hours before the television set blew. Cazzola came to learn that this precise series of events invariably succeeded a death in the family. When someone close to the DeStefanos died, their television would blow out exactly 3 hours later, like clockwork. The same thing happened in February 1959, when Cazzola's wife's grandfather passed away, and in March 1960, when her great-uncle died. Cazzola had the dead TV examined professionally after one of these incidents, and learned that the internal wiring and insulation had melted together into a single solid mass, as if the device had been struck by a lightning bolt. The only deviation from this appalling pattern occurred in May 1962, when Cazzola's father-in-law, Joseph DeStefano, accidentally crushed his hand at work. 3 hours later, the picture tube in the family television set blew out, but the audio remained unaltered. The strange case of the DeStefanos and their television sets strongly evokes the legend of the Forerunner, a peculiarity of Canadian maritime folklore, which bears elements in common with the shrieking banshee of Irish tradition, and the ominous doppelganger of German lore. The Forerunner is a portent of death, perhaps most closely akin to the wraith of Scottish ghost lore, wraiths being the shades of the recently deceased, which appear to friends and family members at the moment of the former's death, as if in an attempt to inform them of this development, or to say goodbye. While classic wraiths manifest as visible apparitions, Forerunners are invisible harbingers of death, which communicate their awful messages through touch and sound. Perhaps the most authoritative summary of the Forerunner phenomenon is a passage from the 1957 classic Blue-Nosed Ghosts, written by Nova Scotian folklorist Dr. Helen Creighton. Forerunners, Creighton wrote in the first chapter of her book, are supernatural warnings of approaching events, and are usually connected with impending death. They come in many forms, and are startling, as though the important thing is to get the hearer's attention. The most common Forerunners are a picture falling off a wall, or a calendar dropping to the floor at the moment when a distant loved one has died. Or you may hear your name called, as I did, when the mother of a friend died, although she had not called me at all. Creighton dedicated a good portion of her book to the Forerunner phenomenon, including 2 such stories in her prologue. The first anecdote she related was her own personal experience, which took place just prior to the death of her sister-in-law, the wife of her eldest brother, who had battled for some time with a deadly sickness. It had been a long illness, she wrote, one that was very hard on both the patient and her family. We turned to anything that would distract the children, and one evening, 3 of us sat in the drawing room playing cards. Suddenly, we were interrupted by a loud knocking. We all heard it, and stopped playing. I made the obvious remark, "There's someone at the door." One of Creighton's daughters pointed out that the sound couldn't possibly have been a person knocking, as there was no door on that side of the house. Nevertheless, to satisfy their mother's curiosity, another of her daughters went to the front door of the house and confirmed that there was indeed no one there. At the time, Creighton was mystified by the experience and made no connection between it and the death of her sister-in-law, which took place shortly thereafter. It was only years later, in 1928, when she interviewed two elderly Nova Scotian brothers as part of an effort to collect traditional maritime folk tunes, that she was made aware that the 3 sharp knocks she had heard on the wall were classic cases of what old Eastern Canadians called death knocks. "These are heard in certain houses or by certain people," she wrote, "and they come as a warning of approaching death. Whether my sister-in-law died on the day following the knocks, or a few days later, none of us could recall. Certainly at the time, we all heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks that insisted upon our attention." I've heard the knocks only once since then, and in a different house. I was sitting at my desk one morning before 12 o'clock when I was startled by 3 distinct knocks. In my house, there are many noises caused partly by the steam heating system and partly by people in other apartments, but there was something about these knocks that disturbed me greatly. Alarmed, Creighton asked her neighbor, who lived in the adjoining bedroom, whether she had also heard the knocks, but the neighbor hadn't heard a thing. Fearing the worst, Creighton drove to the home of a friend whom she had seen earlier that day, who was suffering from a mild illness, but determined that her friend was fine. Later that day, after she had returned to her own apartment, she received a phone call informing her that the husband of a close friend had died in a car accident, around the same time she had heard the knocks. When his wife was asked whom she would like to have with her, Creighton wrote, she had asked for me. Knowing that she would want me, and all 3 of us being very close, I suppose he had been trying to get through to me. Not confined to the traditions of Nova Scotia, the story of the death knock is also a staple of Prince Edward Island folklore. Prince Edward Island, or PEI, being Canada's smallest province, nestled in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, just north of Nova Scotia. Folklorist Sterling Ramsay included one such story in his 1973 book, Folklore, Prince Edward Island. Island people in years gone by, Ramsay wrote in his introduction to the subject, were rather firm believers in forerunners, in supernatural warnings of one kind or another of impending death, or some event that lay ahead in the future. Many people who disclaimed all belief in the supernatural openly admitted to at least one time or another being confronted with a forerunner in one of its many forms. 2 of the most common are the hearing of one's name being called at the time of another's death, and 3 mysterious knocks at the door, when apparently there was no one else around that could have done the knocking. Both of these are found in this one experience, a rather unusual occurrence. Ramsay proceeded to relate the account of a woman from Ellerslie, a rural community located up west, as islanders refer to the wilder western half of their island province. In the summer of 1967, the storyteller and her family moved into a farmhouse at Ellerslie. Shortly after their relocation, her widowed mother came to spend a few weeks with them, as was her summer custom. Although she was 72 years old, her mother was healthy and active, and prided herself on never having been sick a day in her life. It was late one night, on the 2nd week she was with us, the storyteller said, that she came to my bedroom to ask if I had knocked on her door. She had heard 3 knocks, but when she went to the door and looked into the hall, there was nobody to be seen. The next morning, we discovered that no one had been near her room, and she had been the only one to hear the knocking. We were certain that she had imagined the whole thing, but 3 nights later, it happened again. This time, I also heard what sounded like 3 knocks coming from down the hall. Again, we could not discover who or what was responsible. The following week, my mother went home, and I completely forgot what had gone on during her visit. On the first evening after Mother left, I decided to retire early. But sometime during the night, I was awakened by what sounded like a woman's voice. The more I listened, the more it sounded like the voice of my mother calling my name. I was unable to go back to sleep, so I went down to the kitchen and noticed that it was just about 3 o'clock. I put the whole thing down as some sort of strange dream, and thought nothing more of it, until the next morning when I received a call from the woman who shared my mother's home. She had been called to my mother's room at about 2:45 the previous night. Mother seemed deathly ill, and a few minutes later she passed on. I knew then what it had all meant. It is perhaps worth mentioning here that 3 disembodied knocks have been associated with the poltergeist phenomenon, and have been reported in many suspected cases of demonic infestation. For example, readers of this author's 2018 book, Mysteries of Canada Volume 1, may recall the story of Louis and Ethel Hilchey, whose home in a peaceful suburb of Halifax, Nova Scotia, was invaded by some malicious invisible entity on Christmas Eve, 1943, which first announced its presence by shattering the evening's tranquility with 3 deep, hollow-sounding knocks. As controversial American demonologist Ed Warren explained in an interview with writer Gerald Brittle, phenomena that occur in threes are a signature of the demonic. Often, the very first thing to happen in a case of infestation is that there will be 3 knocks at the door. There won't be anybody there, of course, at least nobody visible. 3 is used as a signal. 3 is purposely used as an insult to mock the Trinity. One rare sort of forerunner, evoking the death knock phenomenon, was described by one Venona Houtmacher in her article in the June 1961 issue of Fate. Although Venona was a resident of Toronto, Ontario at the time she penned her story, she had grown up in the rural community of Ship Harbour, on the eastern shores of Nova Scotia, up the coast from Halifax. When she was a little girl, Venona's beautiful young Aunt Min lived with her and her family. Back in 1895, Aunt Min was engaged to marry a fisherman named Dan. Like most members of his profession at the time, Dan spent most of the week sleeping in a shack on one of the little islands which dotted the coastline, from which he could head out to sea in his fishing boat early every weekday morning. Every Saturday night, he and his fellow fishermen came back to the mainland in order to spend Sundays with their families. It was a week before the wedding, on a Saturday night, Venona wrote. A terrible storm had blown up. The wind howled like a banshee. Thunder and lightning rent the skies. The sea rolled in torrents and breakers, rising mountains high, dashed against the shores. The rafters of our house shook with the terrible force of the gale, and everyone remembered the fishermen on the islands who would not be coming home this night. My mother was knitting, and father was reading. We youngsters were busy at our schoolwork. Aunt Min was sitting by the fire with her feet in the oven, as she said that bad storms always gave her a chill. It was late spring, lobster fishing time, but there was always need of a bit of fire. Mother bundled us children off to bed finally, but my room was just off the kitchen, where the family usually spent their evenings, and I could hear every word of the conversation. Aunt Min seemed worried and pensive. I heard her speaking to my father. "Jim," she said, "do you suppose Dan would attempt to cross the bay tonight?" Father answered, "Only a fool would attempt to cross on a night like this, and Dan's no fool." "Well, I don't know," Min continued. "Our wedding night is only a week away, you know. He would want to come in if possible." "Of course he would, Min," Mother said, "but he wouldn't dare try it." "Well, my girl," Father said, half seriously, "if he does, there'll be no wedding. You can be sure of that." Everything was silent for a while then, except for the beat of the storm outside. Suddenly, I heard Aunt Min scream in an angry, high-pitched voice, "Jim, how dare you slap me like that?" "Slap you?" Father said. "Are you crazy, girl? I didn't slap you." "How dumb do you think I am?" Aunt Min replied. "Just don't do it again, Jim. I'm not in the mood for fun." Mother thought that Aunt Min might be getting a sudden jumping toothache, and only imagined she'd been slapped, for certainly no one there had slapped her. But a few moments later, she jumped up again, her voice very angry, accusing Father of slapping her a second time. Father said he thought she was taking leave of her senses, but Aunt Min had been slapped twice, and what else could she think? That her brother was playing a silly trick on her. She had turned around to face Father and Mother then, to put an end to the nonsense, when suddenly she received another hard slap. She could see it had not been Father after all. "But what hit me? Who did it?" she said. And then, quite suddenly, she began to cry. Somehow, Aunt Min knew it was Dan. He had tried to cross the bay after all, and now was in trouble and needed her. She knew it. Deep inside, she knew that Dan was dead. I heard her say so. Grandfather found Dan's boat the following morning, where she had drifted ashore on Catfish Point, her sails flapping loosely in the wind that had died down to a pleasant breeze. Nearby lay Dan's bruised body. It had come drifting in with his boat. Dan had been struck with the boom and apparently knocked overboard unconscious, so there was no wedding after all. But who or what had slapped Aunt Min, and why? Was it Dan's subconscious mind calling to his loved one for help in his hour of need, or did Aunt Min also feel the blows of the boom that killed Dan? We do not know, but we remember the terrible night that something slapped Aunt Min. Following her exposition on the death knock phenomenon, Helen Creighton, in Blue Nose Ghosts, went on to describe a number of other Nova Scotian Forerunner stories she had collected, lumping various phenomena which other folklore traditions know by different names, like premonitions, wills of the wisp, and the aforementioned wraith and doppelganger, under the same broad Forerunner umbrella, as have all other maritime folklorists who have written on the subject. One unique type of Forerunner detailed in Blue Nose Ghosts is a strange and unaccountable noise, which, though initially meaningless to those who hear it, will later be replicated exactly during some heart-rending future scene, such as the funerary preparations of someone known to the hearers. These auditory omens are often, if not invariably, heard in the exact same locations as that at which the events they foretell will later take place. Like the doppelganger phenomenon, they almost inspire the impression that they are the cryptic attempts of some paranormal force to warn the residents of a certain area of an impending tragedy, or to prepare them for some future emotional trauma. Alternatively, proponents of the stone tape theory, the idea that emotionally charged events can be indelibly seared into particular locations and replayed to hapless passersby like ghostly tape recordings, might argue that these oral auguries are the imperishable byproducts of powerful emotions, which are bound to the places at which they were experienced, and which somehow transcend the temporal dimension. A third explanation for this strange phenomenon was proposed by folklorist Mary L. Fraser in her 1932 book, Folklore of Nova Scotia. There is a persistent tradition, Fraser wrote, that the spirits of the living rehearse the making of coffins, the funeral preparations, even the funeral processions. Those who have the second sight see these things. Those who have not very often hear what is going on, although they cannot see them. The second sight to which Fraser referred is an Anglo-Celtic term, borrowed from the British Isles, denoting the gift of clairvoyance, and a sensitivity to preternatural phenomena. Some of those who have written on the subject have proposed that Forerunner stories are so prevalent in Atlantic Canada because, with the exception of the native Mi'kmaq, the descendants of old Acadian settlers, the progeny of German immigrants, and the descendants of black loyalists, most of the region is populated by people of Scottish, Irish, and English stock, those ethnicities supposedly having a higher incidence of that mysterious characteristic. Blue Nose Ghosts contains 2 tales of auditory forerunners, which Helen Creighton heard firsthand. Both of these stories are set in the town of Clark's Harbour, on Cape Sable Island, a bleak, windswept isle, which lies just off the province's southern tip. One of these stories was told by a widow who had spent her whole life in that seaside settlement. When she was a girl, this woman's father spent the winters fishing at sea. In order to keep her mother company, one of her female cousins often moved into their house for the season and slept in her mother's bed at night. One night, the widow told Creighton, at 12 o'clock, something woke them up, and at first, neither of them spoke. Finally, my cousin said, "Aunt Isabel, do you hear anything?" She said yes, she did. It was a frosty night, and what they heard was a rumbling coming down the road. Rumble, 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 rumble. It rumbled by the house like a wagon was going over a frosty road. They were frozen in bed because it seemed to be coming straight towards our house, and that's what it did. It came rumbling around the house, and stopped by the front door. They clung together in terror. Then they heard a knock, like somebody pounding on something that was frozen. Then it sounded like something being thrown away. By and by it started again, and turned around and rumbled back over the road, until the sound was lost in the distance. They couldn't figure it out, because they knew the sound of every wagon and who owned it, and who would that be driving up the road, and turning off and stopping at their very door. Terrified, the storyteller's mother and cousin together roused their neighbor, Maurice Nickerson, and informed him of the strange sounds they had heard. Lantern in hand, Nickerson examined the road outside the house, but could find no evidence of wagon tracks in the snow. He then condescended to spend the night in the lady's house, in order to keep them company, and nobly stood sentry until dawn. These women were terrified that the strange commotion was a forerunner, heralding the death of the man of the house, whom they presumed had drowned at sea. Ma cried and took on something awful, the storyteller said. But the forerunner wasn't for my father. It was for one of the little boys who had taken sick, and in a week was dead from diphtheria. The day he was buried was frosty and cold, just as it had been that night. He had been prepared in the house for burial. Then the hearse started up the road for the funeral, and it made exactly the same noise they had heard. All the people in the house could hear it coming over the frosty ground, and it came rumbling up the frozen road, and rumbled right up to the house. Then it stopped before the door, just the way they had heard it. Ma and my aunt couldn't speak. They were listening for the next thing to happen. The hearse had a door at the back with a lock, and the undertaker couldn't get the lock open, so he picked up a rock and hit it. Then he threw the rock away, exactly as they'd heard it that night. Everything was repeated in detail, and it happened about 60 years ago. Creighton's second story was told to her by Miss Evelyn Swim, a housemate of the widowed teller of the previous story. The strange event which features in this tale is a hybrid of the two types of forerunners above described, namely the death knock and the auditory rehearsal of funerary preparations. One day, years earlier, when Swim lived with her parents, a sick toddler whom she did not identify was sleeping in a room in her family's house. He was not thought sick enough to die, Swim told the folklorist. Mother was stitching, and Aunt Julie had just come from her room when they heard a little knock. Mother said, "You go see who that is." Aunt Julie went, but she came back and said, "Levy, there's nobody there." Then came another knock. She looked out, and still there was nobody there. She went back to the child's room, and everything seemed in order. The knock came then for a third time. They couldn't understand it, unless it was somebody playing a prank, but there was no sign of anybody anywhere. In a few days the baby passed away, and shortly afterwards, the coffin maker came to get the measurements. He put the child's body in the coffin, and he used a hammer to drive little brads into the coffin. This happened 3 times, and was so exactly like the sounds they had heard that they realized it had been a forerunner. Mary Fraser included 2 remarkably similar stories in her own book. In pioneer days, she explained, there were no undertakers, so coffins had to be made in the most convenient places in the neighborhood. Many people heard in advance the assembling of boards for the purpose, and the ghostly strokes of the hammer, as the following stories will show. The first of Fraser's stories was a tale she heard firsthand. One frosty February morning in the early 1890s, 2 cousins drove to their uncle's farmhouse with a wagon load of boards, intending to use their uncle's workshop to build a coffin for an old neighbor who had died in his home nearby. Before they began their work, they were greeted by their female cousin, their uncle's daughter, who said, "I hope you're going to finish your job this time. Many a cold night I lay awake listening to that truck driving up to the door, and those boards being thrown off. Then the sawing, planing, and hammering would begin, that I was terrified to death, for I thought one of the family was going to die." Her story was corroborated by her father, who claimed that he too had heard the disturbing nocturnal construction work, but had never told any of his family members for fear of alarming them. In Fraser's second story, 2 young sisters sat at night in their grandfather's country home with a child whom they knew was dying. All of a sudden, the peaceful night air was rent by the sound of hammering and sawing in their grandfather's workshop outside. A quick investigation revealed that there was nobody in the workshop, and that the girl's grandfather was snoring softly in his bed. "Isn't it strange?" one of the girls remarked. "There's grandfather sleeping quietly, yet listen to his spirit, working out there at the coffin that he'll be making only tomorrow." Sure enough, the child they were watching died before morning, and the girl's grandfather immediately set to work building a coffin, his saw and hammer making the very same sounds they had heard the previous night. Perhaps the eeriest auditory forerunner in Helen Creighton's book is that which features in a story told by Reverend Grant MacDonald, a minister of the United Church in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. MacDonald's story is set near his hometown of Forshoe, located on the southeastern shores of Nova Scotia's Cape Breton Island, a large picturesque landmass which sits off the northern tip of the Nova Scotian peninsula. Just northeast of Forshoe is a narrow cape known as Winging Point, at which a small fishing shack once stood. Shortly after the conclusion of World War I, this shack was occupied by a man named Fred, a newcomer to Cape Breton Island. According to Reverend MacDonald, Fred frequently came to the neighboring village of Gabarus with bloodshot eyes and threadbare nerves, claiming that he could not sleep in his shack on account of hideous shrieks he heard at night on the ocean air. These screams were the heart-rending wails of men in agony and despair, and seemed to seep out of the very atmosphere. His stories were not taken too seriously, Creighton wrote, because he was an outsider, and little was known of his background. But people encouraged him, because he would be almost beside himself as he talked, and they were greatly entertained. Finally, he could take it no longer, and he moved away, and nobody knew what became of him. 5 years later, in the spring of 1924, a Canadian fishing trawler called the Mikado foundered off the shores of Winging Point. The sea was too rough for any of the crew to be rescued, Creighton wrote, and the people on shore looked helplessly on, as sailors and all dropped one by one from the masts to which they had been clinging, shrieking with despair. It was thought some may even have gone insane before they finally lost hold. The fishing shack had been unoccupied for 5 years, ever since Fred had left it. Now it was opened up, and as soon as weather permitted, the bodies were brought in and placed upon the floor. As they were going about their sorry business, the men recalled the sounds that Fred had reported. Ever since then, the people round about concluded that he had heard the forerunner of this event. Another account of this sort of forerunner appears in Sterling Ramsay's book. This tale was told by Islander Jack Murchison and is set in the hamlet of Murray Harbour at the southeastern end of Prince Edward Island. According to the story, one cold winter night, sometime in the 1940s, Jack took his mother on his one-horse sleigh to the home of a neighbor, Angus Matheson, where local ladies were gathering for a Women's Institute meeting. Jack's father, Charlie Murchison, opted to stay home at the farmhouse, pleading indisposition. At about 10 o'clock, Charlie heard Jack's horse violently launch himself over a snowbank in front of the house and crash down soundly on the other side. Believing that his son and wife had returned home, Charlie went to the door and shouted, "Is that you, Jack?" There was no reply. Fearing that some accident may have taken place on the road, and that Jack's horse had returned without him and his mother, Charlie put on his winter clothes and trudged through the snow to the barn. The horse he had heard was nowhere to be seen. Even more curiously, there were no tracks of a horse or sleigh near the snowbank where he had heard the commotion. Baffled, Charlie went back inside and awaited the arrival of Jack and his wife, who returned shortly thereafter. That Sunday morning, Ramsay wrote, Jack Murchison had a request from a Mr. Ev Harris in Murray River. His father-in-law had died, and he wanted Mr. Murchison to go down with the horses and get a rough board box at Murray River. The grave was to be dug at Caledonia. Mr. Murchison took his rather mischievous horse to Murray River, and when he came to turn in his lane, he had the rough board box on the sleigh. The horse jumped and carried on, and proceeded to jump over the snowbank in front of the house. His father, who was then sitting in the house, stated emphatically, "That's the noise I heard Friday night." It seems that Mr. Murchison had, in fact, heard a forerunner of the dead man. Mary Fraser included several auditory forerunners in her own book, Folklore of Nova Scotia. The first story she related was told to her by a man whose grandfather once routinely visited a relative who was confined to bed by a severe illness. One night, she wrote, this relative seemed so near death that he remained until a very late hour. As he was returning home by the highway, walking in the middle of the road, he was almost smothered by some terrible obstruction that he could not see. With difficulty, he succeeded in getting off the road, and then he stood aside and listened. He could hear distinctly the sound of passing feet. Then came the clatter of wagon wheels, which he could even hear going over a stone on the road. He waited until what seemed like a whole procession had gone by, then made for his home. Early the following morning, the man returned to the scene of his strange experience to see whether the phantom procession he had heard and felt had left any evidence of its passage in the light dusting of snow that covered the ground. None could be found. The very next day, the sick relative died, convincing the storyteller's grandfather that he had encountered the forerunner of his funeral. Fraser went on to relate a similar story, in which two sisters, while walking home from their grandmother's house, found themselves caught in the midst of a phantom cavalcade, which proved to all appearances to be a ghostly rehearsal of a funeral procession which headed down that road the very next day. This particular forerunner also appears in the folklore of Prince Edward Island. As Sterling Ramsay explained, islanders may remember how, as children, they were cautioned never, under any circumstances, to walk in the middle of the road. Perhaps they are not familiar with the rather obscure origins of this superstition. In part, the warning is against being run over or trampled by the horses which frequented island roads once upon a time. But the complete explanation goes further than just a matter of safety. It was all a matter of one of the most common manifestations of a forerunner on Prince Edward Island, namely that the horses in a funeral procession often passed over a road several days before a man, woman, or child in the district died. The most famous forerunner tale in the Canadian Maritimes is that alleged to have taken place at the Kirk of St. James, a Presbyterian church near downtown Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, on October 7, 1853. Early that morning, so the story goes, a sea captain named Cross set out on foot from the district of Brighton, at Charlottetown's southwestern end, bound for a particular stable to the northeast, where he expected to pick up a horse that his father had sent him from England. At about 5:30 in the morning, when he was halfway over Black Sam's Bridge, a bygone structure located near the present-day confluence of Euston and Rochford Street, near downtown Charlottetown, a bell began to ring nearby. Captain Cross's first instinct was that the peals were those of a ship's bell, signifying the arrival of a ship in the harbour, but when he looked towards the waterfront, there were no strange vessels in sight. Intrigued, Cross walked in the direction of the incessant clanging, and found that it emanated from the bell tower of the Kirk of St. James. As he approached the place of worship, he saw 3 women dressed in white gowns, standing on the church threshold, the double doors of the main entrance wide open before them. The women seemed oblivious to the approaching sea captain, and did not raise their eyes in his direction. A 4th white-clad figure could be seen through the slatted windows of the bell tower, ringing the church bell vigorously. Captain Cross was not the only Charlottetown resident drawn to the church by the mysterious tolling. Both the parish's pastor, Reverend Dr. William Snodgrass, and its sexton, Davy Nicholson, knew that there was no occasion for the bell to be ringing at such an early hour. Suspecting that some impious pranksters had broken into the church and decided to give the town an early morning wake-up call, they both simultaneously leapt out of bed when they heard the bell's strident peals, and made their ways with all haste towards the Kirk of St. James. The younger Nicholson arrived at the church around the same time as Captain Cross. Like the latter, he clearly saw 3 white-robed women standing on the threshold of the church, and a 4th in the belfry, laying on the bell. Before the 2 men had a chance to approach the women and inquire as to the reason for their untimely and unsanctioned bell-ringing operation, the church doors closed on them in unison. The mysterious bell ringer also disappeared, leaving no sign of her presence but the lingering vibrations of the bell's final peal. Astonished, both Cross and Nicholson tried the church doors, but found them locked. At that moment, Reverend Dr. Snodgrass rounded the corner. Cross and Nicholson told the minister about the 3 women and the vanishing figure in the bell tower, but Snodgrass dismissed their story as preposterous, demanding that Nicholson open the church and search the belfry for the pranksters that were surely hidden there. The sexton did as requested, with the assistance of Captain Cross, but found the tower empty. Later that morning, a mail steamer called the Fairy Queen left Charlottetown Harbour bound for Pictou, Nova Scotia, on the other side of the Northumberland Strait. At the time of her departure, the Fairy Queen was said to have been in very poor condition, her rotting hull having been freshly painted in an effort to disguise its frail constitution from the eyes of discerning passengers. That afternoon, not far from her destination, the steamer was beset by a ferocious October gale, which belied the reassurances of her painted facade. The Fairy Queen sank in the frigid waters of the Northumberland Strait, resulting in the drowning of 4 men and 3 women. 3 of the deceased were parishioners at the Kirk of St. James, and in the wake of the disaster, many Charlottetown residents suspected that the 3 white-clad women seen earlier that morning, along with the mysterious bell ringing that initially struck Captain Cross as the peals of a ship's bell, were forerunners portending the wreck of the Fairy Queen. Readers of this author's work may already be familiar with the Phantom Train of Medicine Hat, Alberta, a strange story, first written down by columnist Ken Little of the Lethbridge Herald in the spring of 1966, and immortalized in Albertan Senator F.W. Gershaw's 1967 book, Samus, the Medicine Hat. Andrew Staceco, began Little in his original article, who retired in 1955 after 48 years in Canadian Pacific train service, pulled his treasured engineer's watch from his shirt pocket, where he has carried it since vests went out of style. It was time for us to catch the Phantom Train. You can believe or disbelieve the story Mr. Staceco told, but he produced documented evidence that something mighty strange happened on 2 occasions amid cutbanks on the line between Medicine Hat and Dunmore in the summer of 1908. Little went on to explain how, in the early 1900s, an engineer named Bob Toohey and a stoker named Gus Day worked for the Canadian Pacific Railway out of the city of Medicine Hat, Alberta, in the southeastern corner of the province. One night in May 1908, these 2 associates were tasked with bringing a train from Medicine Hat to the easterly town of Dunmore, coupling with a passenger train called the Spokane Flyer, and continuing west beyond Lethbridge and into the Crow's Nest Pass. At a point about 2 miles outside of town at that time, where the Canadian Pacific Railway climbs out of the South Saskatchewan River Valley and onto the open prairie, the Canadian Pacific Railway wraps around a cutbank fronting a stream called Ross Creek. This cutbank obstructs the view of the tracks on both sides, preventing both eastbound and westbound trainmen from seeing what lies around the corner. On that fateful night, while they were making their way around the cutbank, Bob Toohey and Gus Day heard a sound that made their blood run cold. The warning whistle of an oncoming train, fast approaching from the east. Moments later, a train's headlights appeared around the cutbank, heralding an imminent head-on collision. Before Day had time to leap from the gangplank, or Toohey the opportunity to crank the brake lever, the approaching locomotive glided laterally off the tracks and sped past, floating on the air. Day stood at the cab doorway, and Toohey's hand remained suspended for the brake valve, Little wrote, as a string of phantom coaches sped past. The coach windows were lighted, and crew members waved a greeting from places where crew members would be expected to be found waving greetings as trains passed. And then the Phantom disappeared. Toohey and Day, each fearful of what the other might have thought had they expressed feelings, said nothing. They continued to Dunmore, coupled to the Spokane Flyer, and finished the night without further incidents. 2 weeks after the strange event, Toohey and Day encountered each other on the streets of Medicine Hat. Both men had spent the interim consumed by thoughts of their bizarre experience, and found the courage to ask what the other had seen that night. To their relief, Toohey and Day found that their recollections of the event were identical. Toohey proceeded to explain that the apparition had spooked him so thoroughly that he had gone to see a fortune teller, who predicted that he would die within the month. In an effort to forestall his upcoming appointment with his maker, he decided to take a few days off work.
Day, on the other hand, could not afford that luxury, and was compelled to remain on the job. A few nights after his conversation with Toohey, Day found himself working on the same engine, this time alongside an engineer named J. Nicholson. At exactly the same spot, Little wrote, the phantom train again appeared, headed toward them with whistle blowing and headlight burning. And again it simply evaporated into the darkness, as its crew members again waved greetings from their positions on its engine and cars. On the morning of June 8, 1908, Gus Day was assigned to yard service, and a stoker named Harry Thompson took his place in the engine room. Thompson's crew, led by engineer J. Nicholson, was to take their train from Medicine Hat to Dunmore, couple with the Spokane Flyer, and travel east to the town of Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. They left Medicine Hat and headed into the hills, Little wrote. About 100 yards from the spot where the phantom train had been seen on 2 different nights and by 2 different crews, another train appeared around a curve, headed straight for them. This time it was daylight, and it was for real. It was number 514, the passenger train coming in from Lethbridge, and the man at the throttle was Bob Toohey, who had overcome his fears and returned to work. A front-page article in the next day's issue of the Medicine Hat News explained what happened next. The collision took place on the elevated piece of track just in front of the Pruitt Brickyard property. One of the workmen was just about to cross the track from the west side and was in such a position that he could see both trains, which each was blocked from view of the other by the high cut bank, around which the track makes an abrupt curve of this point. He waved frantically to Engineer Toohey, and the latter apparently realized the danger as he sprang back and reversed his engine. Just as he appeared at the cab door again, the 2 engines met, and a dense pall of steam and smoke settled over the wreck for some minutes. When it cleared away, the sight presented was one which will never be forgotten by those who witnessed it. Engine number 702, Spokane Flyer, was forced back off its front truck, and the whole front of the boiler head was torn off. The express car on the Crow train had been partially telescoped through the mail and baggage car and a tourist car. All 3 cars rolled into the ditch with the locomotive. Engineer Nicholson was quite dead when drawn from the wreck, as was Howard Gray, fireman of the Crow engine. Baggage man Archambault was instantly killed when his car telescoped. The 2 passengers which were also killed were Messrs. Jas Shaw and Duncan McEachran of Bow Island. 3 more men were seriously injured in the crash and were taken to the Medicine Hat Hospital in precarious condition. One of these was Bob Toohey, whose leg was broken and whose body had been battered. True to the fortune teller's predictions, the engineer soon succumbed to his injuries.
3 remarkable tales of CPR mystery appeared in the July 1962 issue of the magazine Fate, in an article written by Julie C. Crawford. Julie learned these stories from her father, Matthew Fulton Crawford, a senior locomotive engineer who worked for the Canadian Pacific Railway. According to Julie, Matthew Crawford, prior to his death in 1954 at the age of 92, was the last living person to have been present at the driving of the CPR's famous Last Spike on November 7, 1885, at Craigalackie, BC. The men who pioneered the Canadian Pacific Railway through British Columbia, Julie began, had many hair-breadth escapes from sudden death, and most of them attributed their survival to warnings of one kind or another they had received. Wherever a group of railwaymen gathered, sooner or later, the conversation turned to this subject, and around some of these true warnings have grown up legends that persist to this day. Matthew Crawford received his first psychic warning while he was a young man, during a routine trip from the newly incorporated city of Kamloops to the community of North Bend in the Fraser Canyon. It was in the spring of 1895, Julie wrote, not far from the spot where the Thompson River empties into the mighty Fraser. The track there runs through a twisting series of curves that are still, at times, subject to mud and rock slides that come hurtling down the hillsides after a rain or snowfall, blocking the track for years, and sometimes carrying it away altogether. Matthew's experience took place on a dark and rainy night, when the locomotive headlight only dimly pierced the heavy precipitation that was quickly transforming the Thompson and Fraser canyons into a muddy morass. With the darkness having thrown its heavy shroud over the spectacular scenery which that stretch of railroad afforded trainmen in the daytime, Matthew's mind began to wander. Soon, he found himself thinking about his young wife, who had died suddenly and unexpectedly in childbirth. In the darkness, Julie wrote, she seemed very near to him. As he reminisced, Matthew was suddenly struck by the uneasy feeling that the pouring rain which so hampered his visibility would trigger a rock slide that night, somewhere in the Thompson or Fraser canyons. He said as much to the inexperienced fireman who sat in the opposite seat, sipping tea. The younger man tried to allay his fear, assuring him that the watchman on duty that night, a competent railroad veteran called Old Honey, would be extra vigilant in such nasty weather. Suddenly, out of the blue, Matthew heard a voice in his ear say, "Stop. Don't go any further." "What did you say?" he asked the fireman. "What did you see ahead?" "I didn't see anything or say anything," his colleague replied, "because I wasn't looking out of the window. What's the matter with you?" "But you said to stop," Matthew retorted. "I said no such thing. Why would I? Don't go getting pipe dreams, Matt." No sooner had the fireman turned his back than Matthew heard the clear command, "Stop. Stop right now." Matthew stared at the fireman, who was preparing to refuel the firebox, apparently unaware of the startling injunctions that were causing his partner so much consternation. He then leaned out the window, but could only see a few feet ahead on account of the rain and the darkness. As he hesitated, the same strange voice barked, "Stop." This time, Matthew obeyed and cranked the brake lever. "Well, what do you think you're doing?" the fireman asked. "They aren't going to like this back on the tail." "I'm stopping the train," Matthew replied quietly, "and I don't care whether they like it or not. Someone, or something, told me to stop, and I'm doing just that, till I find out what's ahead." As Matthew, torch in hand, made to exit the train, he was accosted on the gangway by the conductor and the brakeman, who seemed intent on giving him a thorough dressing down. When he explained the reason for his action, the conductor nodded soberly and volunteered to accompany him on foot to see if anything unusual lay up ahead on the tracks. When the young fireman scoffed at this display of superstition, the conductor gave him a sharp look and snapped, "You're still pretty green about these things, ain't you? After a while you'll learn, maybe. If you don't, you'll be no use on a railroad." With that, Matthew and the conductor stepped into the mud. After trudging about 100 yards up the tracks, the two men stopped and motioned for the fireman and brakeman, who watched derisively from the train, to join them. "My God," the fireman whispered as he approached the two veterans. "Look at that." "Yes, you should thank God," Matthew replied. "For certainly, but for that warning, we'd be in the Fraser now." Just up ahead, a huge rock slide had swept the track and the embankment on which it rested 100 feet below into the Fraser River. "Let this be a warning to you, my lad," the conductor told the brakeman sternly. "When a seasoned railroader like Matt says he has a hunch to stop, he has a hunch. See you never forget what you've learned tonight, if you want to be a railroader." Matthew Crawford's next strange experience took place about a year later, in the spring of 1896, on a night much like the aforementioned. This time, his train was eastbound, destined for Kamloops. His fireman on this trip was his brother-in-law, John Jack Ladner. Although naturally a cheerful and carefree soul, Jack had an uneasy feeling about this particular journey, confidentially remarking several times to his brother-in-law that he would be glad to get home in one piece that night. Matthew and Jack were drinking tea in the cab while the train skirted the shores of Kamloops Lake, a winding stretch of track typified by sharp curves and short tunnels. When they reached a bend in the road, a short distance from the Cherry Creek Tunnel, roughly halfway down the lake, the cab gong began to ring. This gong was connected to the caboose by a long cord which ran across the top of the train, and was designed to ring automatically at both ends whenever the train broke apart, which happened with casual frequency in those days of handbrakes, alerting both the conductor and the engineer. Baffled as to how the train could have broken apart at that relatively flat grade, Matthew nonetheless seized the throttle and slowed the engine to a stop. No sooner had the gong stopped ringing than Matthew and Jack were approached by conductor Sam Jones, who wanted to know the reason for their unscheduled pit stop. Jack, his gloomy foreboding apparently forgotten, facetiously asked Jones whether he and the brakeman had been arguing about the upcoming federal election, the candidates being Wilfrid Laurier for the Liberals and Charles Tupper for the Conservatives, and had pulled the cord in their agitation. On the contrary, the conductor and his colleague had been cooking breakfast, doing their best to watch their language in the company of Father Jean-Marie Raphael Lejeune, a French Catholic priest who served as the superior of the St. Louis Mission in Kamloops, whom they had picked up earlier in their journey. Neither of them had pulled the cord, and Jones had seen no sign of a break on his way up to the cab. Suspecting that the cord had been pulled by a hobo hiding somewhere on the train, the crew made a quick search of all the places where train hoppers typically rode, but were unable to find any trace of an unpaying passenger. Having exhausted all rational explanations, the crew proceeded on toward the Cherry Creek Tunnel. But no sooner had the train begun to drift around the long curve Julie rode than the gong rang again, loud and insistent. At the same time, Jack, who had his head out of the window, drew it in to shout, "My God, Matt, the mouth of the tunnel is blocked with a slide. Shut her off and jump for your life. Quick, before we hit." In less time than it takes to tell, both men had jumped through the cab windows, since there was no time to seek the usual way out of the stricken engine, as she mounted the huge rock pile and lay there a broken thing, panting out great clouds of steam in the dawn air. Matthew Crawford landed on the sandy slope of the lakeshore, on which he broke his wrist, struck his head, and was knocked unconscious. Jack Ladner, on the other hand, hurled himself onto a pile of rocks, on which he injured his back severely. The rest of the crew was mercifully unhurt, and quickly tended to their injured colleagues. Father Lejeune, also unscathed, volunteered to walk to the Cherry Creek station and inform the operator of the obstacle. If the gong had not rang, and Dad had not stopped the train just before the accident, Julie wrote, both of them would have been killed, for the train would have plowed into the rock pile, going at full speed. Jack managed to get the gong from the repair crew, and for years hung it beneath his window, so that the call boy, summoning him in the middle of the night, needed only to pull the cord to wake him. On the southern edge of the Canadian Prairie province of Alberta, just 27 kilometers northeast of the Coots border crossing, lies Writing on Stone Provincial Park, one of the strangest looking places in the whole country. This desert-like stretch of the Milk River Valley, in the shadow of Montana's Sweetgrass Hills, is more congruous with the surface of the moon than the wilds of the Great White North, with its eerie sandstone hoodoos and wavy sedimentary cliffs, supposed to have been carved millennia ago by the waning glaciers of the last ice age. These Badlands were once regarded as sacred by members of the Blackfoot Confederacy, an alliance of 4 related tribes who dominated the western prairies from the North Saskatchewan River to the Missouri. For centuries, Blackfoot youths made vision quests to the area in the hope of attaining the guardianship of one of the many powerful spirits said to haunt that unearthly country. Writing on Stone owes its name to the many petroglyphs and pictographs carved and painted on sandstone walls throughout the area, most of them inscribed by long-forgotten native medicine men. The most complex of these, and one of the park's only petroglyphs not sequestered in the archaeological preserve, is the so-called battle scene, located at the end of the Hoodoo Trail. This glyph depicts over 250 characters, including 115 warriors armed with bows and muskets, and 17 horses, some of them hitched to travois. This scene depicts one of the most decisive victories of the South Piegan Blackfeet, a bloody conflict known as Retreat Up the Hill Battle, fought on the banks of the Milk River, just east of the park, in the fall of 1866. Incredibly, according to Blackfoot tradition, the battle scene was carved before the battle took place by some mysterious prophetic artist, warning the Blackfeet of what to expect and foretelling their victory. Legend has it that, before the battle, a South Piegan war party came to Writing on Stone and saw petroglyphs portending an imminent attack. With this foreknowledge, the warriors were able to ambush and defeat a combined war party of Gros Ventre, Crow, and Plains Cree, which had come to the area seeking Blackfoot scalps, whose presence was foretold by the lithic omen. According to a Blackfeet elder named Bird Rattle, whose version of the event,
related to American civil engineer Roland Wilcombe during his visit to the area in 1924, appears on a didactic sign in the park. The South Piegan warriors managed to dispatch more than 300 enemy braves in this conflict. In his mid-20th century field notes on Blackfoot belief, now housed in Calgary, Alberta's Glenbow Archives, American ethnologist Dr. Claude Everett Schaefer said that some Blackfoot attributed the mysterious rock art of writing on stone to the work of bluebirds, endowed with this artistic ability by the Thunderbird, the colossal winged creator of thunder and lightning. Others, like Schaefer's informant Jim Whitecalf, believed that the petroglyphs of writing on stone were made by spirits who know everything and can predict the future. Greengrass Bull claimed that bluebirds drew dotted pictures on the stone cliffs with their beaks, Schaefer wrote. He had seen this done, as had Old Bullchild. There was a cliff north of the Sweetgrass Hills that carried pictures predictive of the future. These had been done by the bluebirds. They were given power from the sky to do this. Shortface claimed that thunder created the bluebird and gave the bird its paint. The rock cliff north of Sweetgrass Hills carries picture writing too high to be reached by humans, i.e. done by birds long ago. Schaefer went on to relate the tale of a Blackfoot brave named Many Spotted Horses, who went on a vision quest in writing on stone long ago. He was warned by a spirit to leave the place, Schaefer wrote, as humans are forbidden to see the birds do writing on the cliff. The novice continued to fast there, despite warning that he would not live long. That night, he saw birds of different colors flying about the cliffs. The bluebird said that his blue color would last longer than others. He awakened to see bluebirds and others poking figures on the stone cliff. All the birds pecked out plain drawings, but the bluebird was able to make drawings of different colors. The novice started to make fun of the birds, refusing to believe what they said. They warned him that he wouldn't live long, but would see his picture on the cliff. He awakened next morning, went to the cliff, and saw the representation of himself, with his head cut off. He started for home. En route, he was killed by the Crees, who cut off his head. People still journey to the cliff to see what the future has in store for them. Another tale of prophecy from writing on stone appears in Scots Cree frontiersman James Francis Sanderson's 1894 series, Indian Tales of the Canadian Prairies, initially published in the Medicine Hat News. According to this tale, two Plains Cree chiefs and brothers-in-law named Little Gun and the Man Who Didn't Miss left the Moose Jaw Valley in what is now south-central Saskatchewan and led a war party of 14 braves into Blackfoot country in 1872, traveling by way of the Cypress Hills and the Milk River. Near Writing on Stone, one of the party's scouts returned with news that a Piegan camp numbering 100 teepees lay nearby. Little Gun, having made medicine, Sanderson wrote, told the young men that if they preferred to avoid a battle, they could make a detour and pass the camp of the enemy. The Man Who Didn't Miss, however, declared that he would not return home without fighting the Blackfoot, so as to avenge the death of his son, who had died the previous winter. On hearing this, Sanderson wrote, Little Gun asked the men if they were willing to go and attack the enemy, and they said they were. Then, said Little Gun, half of us will never see our homes again, or if over half of us should return from the fight, everyone will be wounded. I am no coward, as you know, and I will go with you, but I think my brother-in-law has done wrong in inducing you to undertake this fight. This I know, that neither he nor I will ever see our campfire again. With this ominous portent ringing in their ears, the warriors prepared themselves for battle and made for the Blackfoot camp. In the skirmish that ensued, the Man Who Didn't Miss was shot dead immediately, and 6 more Cree braves, including Little Gun, lost their lives. 13 Piegan were killed in the engagement, but only one of them gave up his scalp. Thus, Sanderson concluded, was the rashness of one man punished, and the prediction of the other literally verified. As we have explored in previous pieces, the folklore of Atlantic Canada is replete with tales of forerunners, mysterious sounds which are retrospectively determined to be omens of disaster. Nova Scotian folklorist Helen Creighton included many tales of these paranormal warnings in her 1957 classic Blue Nose Ghosts, some of which we will reproduce here. One of these stories, set in the community of Jordan Falls at the southern tip of Nova Scotia, begets the cheerful notion that mysterious omens of impending doom might actually be helpful warnings, the heeding of which allows for the averting of said disasters,
rather than gloomy foreshadowings of some inevitable predetermined fate permanently etched onto the unchanging fabric of time. At Jordan Falls, Creighton wrote, the story is told of a vessel that was supposed to sail out of Shelburne with a crew of 18 or 20 men. One Ephraim Doane was lying in his berth when he heard the mainmast fall. He got up to investigate and found the mainmast intact. So he took this as a warning, and the vessel sailed to Boston without him. It was December 1888, and there was a great gale. The ship was lost off the New England coast with all hands, but the man who had heard the mainmast fall was spared. Creighton heard a similar story from the widow of a sea captain from the town of Liverpool at the southeastern end of the province. One day, while in his cabin preparing for a voyage at sea, the captain was struck by a stack of papers hurled at him from across the room. Turning around, the sailor saw a man-sized blaze of fire burning in the center of the room. A voice issued from the inferno, telling him that if he sailed in that ship one more time, he would be lost at sea, but if he heeded the warning, he would live to be an old man and die at home in his bed. The captain promptly resigned his post, to the bewilderment of his crew. A new captain was appointed, and the ship set sail, to be lost with all hands somewhere on the Atlantic. After that, the widow said, he sailed on ships all over the world, and it was just as the voice said. When he died, he was an old man, and he died at home in his bed. Creighton's third tale about a useful forerunner featured a French-Canadian sailor from Pubnico, an old Acadian village at Nova Scotia's southern tip. One day, while embarking on a ship at Shelburne Harbour, about 37 kilometers northeast of his hometown, the sailor saw a vision of his mother, who implored him not to sail. It was so vivid, Creighton wrote, that he jumped overboard and swam to shore. On that trip, the ship was lost, and all hands perished. Creighton included many more Forerunner tales in her book, in which the mysterious warnings failed to prevent the disasters they foretold. One of these is set near the village of Petite Rivière, on the eastern shores of Nova Scotia, just south of the historic German-Canadian settlement of Lunenburg. If the young man in our next story had been of Scottish instead of German descent, Creighton wrote in her introduction to this tale, he might have been better prepared for the following tragedy. He was coming home from Petite Rivière to his home at Broad Cave one foggy night, when he saw a woman alongside the road, and as he described it, she was a mass of fire. One night shortly after that, when his mother was going to bed, he heard her scream. He hastily flung open her door and found her a mass of flame. He tried to save her and was badly burned, but his help was too late. The lamp she was carrying must have overturned and set fire to her nightclothes. Creighton went on to relate two more Forerunner stories with unhappy endings. In one of them, a woman saw the apparition of a strange man, whom she took to be a physician, standing in the doorway of her home. 2 weeks later, her husband broke his leg and was treated by the very doctor whom the wife had seen in her vision. Another story which Creighton recorded tells of a fisherman who saw a strange shape-shifting shawl in the ocean, which sank when he tried to retrieve it. 3 days later, his wife died in childbirth. Other Nova Scotian Forerunner stories can be found in Mary L. Fraser's 1932 book, Folklore of Nova Scotia. One of Fraser's tales, told by an intimate friend of the witness, takes place on Cape Breton Island, the rugged landmass north of the Nova Scotian peninsula, on a lonely country road between the towns of Baddeck and Margaree. One night, while returning home from a sick call, a doctor traveling by carriage stopped in the middle of the road, his horse being unwilling to proceed. Then the doctor saw a light come towards him, Fraser wrote. Nearer it approached, until it stood just in front of him. Then gradually, there appeared in its midst the outline of a human face, by which degrees evolved into a countenance so beautiful that he could not tire of looking at it. At last it began to grow dimmer and dimmer, until it disappeared into a ball of light. Then this too faded away. The doctor was so much impressed by it, that although it was after midnight when he reached home, he awakened his wife to tell her of the strange happening. Then he lay awake all night thinking about it. 1 week later, the doctor was called out to the same stretch of road on which his extraordinary experience had taken place, a family of 3 having been thrown from their carriage in an accident. He first went to attend the woman who was moaning and groaning, Fraser wrote. Then he picked up the child, who was lying perfectly still. At a glance, he saw it was dead. Its beautiful face he recognized as the face he had seen in the ball of light. Another of Fraser's Forerunner tales, which appears to be a maritime variation of the German legend of the doppelganger, is set near the town of Antigonish, at the northern end of the Nova Scotian peninsula. A young man was attending school at Antigonish, Fraser wrote, a distance of 11 miles from his home in Glen Alpin. On one occasion, he walked the whole distance in order to get home for a holiday. That night, although he was very tired, he could not sleep. As he lay awake in a little bedroom off the parlor, he happened to look out into that room, and was horrified to see the dead body of his sister laid out just opposite him. As she was in very good health at the time, he concealed his strange experience from the family. A month later, he was summoned home for her death. She was laid out just where he had seen her. Stories like these, in which a person has a premonition of something terrible befalling a loved one, or is somehow struck by a terrible sense of dread at the very moment that such an event takes place, are the most poignant tales of ESP, or extrasensory perception, suggesting the existence of some sort of psychic bond which ties us to our friends and family. Helen Creighton included some of these stories in Blue Nose Ghosts. One involves two brothers named Rod and Hector, who hailed from the rural community of Scottsburn, in Pictou County, in Nova Scotia's North Shore region. One day, while Rod was building a wooden bridge, a timber slipped, causing the heavy supports to fall on him and injure him severely. In his distress, Rod's thoughts drifted to his brother, whom he wished was there to help him. At that very moment, Hector was driving to the town of Pictou, Nova Scotia, about 12 kilometers to the west. All of a sudden, he was overwhelmed by the sensation that Rod was in trouble and needed his help. Unable to shake the disturbing sensation, he turned around and headed back to Scottsburn. On the way, Hector stopped to pick up a friend who could see his obvious anxiety and asked him what was wrong. Hector told him about his hunch, and the friend nodded soberly. Neither of the two were particularly surprised when they arrived at Scottsburn to see Rod's injured body being carried into the house. Another story where the family tie was very strong, Creighton wrote, came from the same county. A man and his wife arose one morning and set out for the house of their daughter Mary, without the slightest idea of why they were going. As they approached her house, they met a friend who said, "I'm so glad you've come. Isn't it too bad about Mary?" "What happened?" they asked. "Didn't you know? She went to bed last night as well as we are, and died in her sleep." Creighton went on to tell another tale about a beloved matronly woman named Mrs. Bishop, who at the time of publication lived in the community of Westfall, Nova Scotia, on the northern outskirts of Dartmouth. One of her friends was a young, sickly bachelor who, like many others in the settlement, often came to her for comfort and encouragement. About 5 years ago, Creighton wrote, Mrs. Bishop had retired for the night and was reading in bed, when suddenly everything in the house became very quiet, as it does sometimes just before something happens. She kept expecting a rap on the door or a telephone call, and the tension lasted a good 15 minutes. At that time, the young man was presumably on his way to see her, but was stricken on the ferry, lost his balance, fell in the harbor, and was drowned. Another story illustrating this eerie phenomenon was published in the January 1953 issue of the magazine Fate, under the headline Parental Prescience. According to this brief article, a 22-year-old outdoor enthusiast named Dave Thompson and his friend Alan McBurney decided to test their canoeing skills on Ontario's Kapuskasing River, a remote northern waterway in the James Bay drainage basin. They decided to shoot a particular rapid, overturned their canoe, and drowned in the frothing white water. At the very moment at which it was supposed that Dave and Alan were struggling in the current, Dave's father, who lived in Vancouver, BC, more than 1,700 miles or 2,700 kilometers to the west, was struck by a peculiar urge which prompted him to phone his son. 1 hour later, Dave and Alan's empty canoe was found washed up on the banks of the river, starkly declaring its occupant's tragic fate. A less dramatic account of familiar foresight appeared in the July 1959 issue of Fate, in an article by Herbert H. Wilkins of New Westminster, British Columbia, entitled The Broken Finger. The author, who in the introduction diagnosed himself with an incurable case of wanderlust, described a strange dream he had while sailing home from an excursion to the South Atlantic. In the dream, Wilkins wrote, My two brothers and I were in the room we called the schoolroom, where the governess gave my brothers and sisters their lessons. It was raining, and we three were having some target practice with an air pistol I was taking home as a present for Rex, my youngest brother and my favorite. He had just fired the 3 vacuum cup arrows at the target, and had gone to count his score, when Gus, my other brother, put a dart into the pistol and aimed at the back of Rex's head. I picked up a club, which was lying on a table, and knocked the pistol out of Gus's hand, breaking his middle finger at the top joint. 2 months later, I was home. It was pouring rain, and my two brothers and I decided to have a shooting match. The governess was home for her holiday, and we went into the schoolroom. Everything happened just as I had dreamed it in the South Atlantic, except that it was the second flange of Gus's finger that I broke. A similar story involving a prophetic dream appeared in an article entitled Premonitions, written by Frank Sudlow of Victoria, British Columbia, and published the July 1960 issue of Fate. I've had a few psychic experiences, Sudlow wrote, such as the time a friend and I decided to go for a bicycle ride in the country, in New South Wales, Australia, one fine warm afternoon, along rough, winding, hilly roads. My mother warned my friend that she had a strong feeling he would have a bad accident if he went. Going down a steep grade, he got into a patch of deep, loose gravel and was thrown from his bike, sustaining numerous severe cuts and bruises. I once dreamed that a scaffold I was working on with my brother collapsed under us while we were putting up weatherboards on the side of a house. The next day, we built just such a scaffold and started putting up weatherboards. Suddenly, the scaffold gave way beneath us. We fell to the ground, but were not injured. The last prophetic dream we will recount here was described in an article in the February 1961 issue of Fate. According to the author, in October 1960, a sprightly little old man from the city of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, decided to make a trip to Detroit, Michigan. One night during his holiday, he dreamed he was watching the horse races at the track at Hazel Park. In his dream, the first 2 races were won by horses numbered 10 and 3. On October 6th, he headed to Hazel Park and bet on the horses from his dream. He bought 5 $2 tickets on the Daily Double, the article explained, which paid $1,256 for a $2 wager, highest in the 1960 Michigan racing season, and collected $6,280 as a result of a dream, the kind of dream we all wish for. For most of the characters in these stories, paranormal warnings of disaster are rare once-in-a-lifetime occurrences. There are some Canadians, however, who seem to be blessed or cursed with the gift of foresight, who, by dint of some mysterious genetic trait, or by the will of Providence, are regularly bombarded with hazy snapshots of the future, the windows of their minds randomly thrown open onto the murky train tracks of time. One of these was the late James H.P. Wilkie, a renowned Scots-Canadian psychic who died in 2007. Another was the so-called Witch of Plum Hollow, Upper Canada, whose story we may explore in a future piece. The career of another Canadian clairvoyant is summarized in the 1879 book, History of Leeds in Grenville, Ontario, from 1749 to 1879, by Thaddeus Levitt and E.A. Turner, the former, incidentally, being an authority on the Witch of Plum Hollow. The brief biography of this singular psychic was reprinted in an essay on the folklore of Ontario's Oxford and Waterloo counties, near the city of Kitchener, written by Canadian archaeologist William John Wintenberg, and published in the 1888 issue of the Journal of American Folklore. At an early date, Levitt and Turner wrote, there lived in the city of Kilmarnock, on the north side of the Rideau River, a man by the name of Crouch, who claimed to have the gift of foresight. Many old and respected settlers believed that he received warnings of the approaching death of any person who resided in the settlement. According to the testimony of his wife, who bore the reputation of being a Christian woman, Crouch would frequently retire to bed, where in vain he would seek slumber. Restless and uneasy, he would toss from side to side, at times groaning and muttering names of the departed. Do what he would to shake off the mysterious spell, in the end he was compelled to submit. Rising, he would quickly dress himself, take his canoe and paddle across the river, where he declared he always found waiting a spectral funeral procession, which he would follow to the graveyard, where all the rites and ceremonies would be performed. Crouch, having watched the ghostly mourners fade away, would then return home, retire to rest, and sink into a profound slumber. It was always with the greatest difficulty that Mrs. Crouch could ever elicit from her husband the name of the party whose death had been heralded.
It is related of the late Samuel Rose that upon one occasion, when he was in the company of Crouch, in crossing a common, both saw a light. Crouch exclaimed, "Did you hear that cry?" "No," replied Mr. Rose. "Oh," said the fatalist, "it was the cry of a child, the name of which he gave. In a few days, the child breathed its last." Upon another occasion, he predicted the death of a man named McIntyre. Colonel Hurd, of Burritt's Rapids, informs us that he knew Crouch, and that far and wide he was regarded with terror by the children, who had learned from their parents his supposed power of communing with the spirits of the dead. According to a brief article in the December 1962 issue of Fate, another Canadian clairvoyant, a nameless fortune teller, told one Alfred Kasprick, a young dairy manager from Neepawa, Manitoba, that he would be lucky to reach the age of 30. Kasprick himself had a deep and unaccountable fear of the date Friday the 13th, and always took pains to avoid taking risks on those inauspicious days. On Friday, April 13th, 1962, while driving on a lonely highway, Kasprick's car lost control and rolled into a ditch. 2 days later, at the age of 30, he died of a fractured skull. Another tale of Canadian clairvoyance hidden away in the pages of Fate was written by Curtis Fuller and printed in the April 1954 issue of that publication. This story involves the disappearance of a 60-year-old Toronto-based physician and outdoor recreationist named William Fleming, who disappeared in the bush near Parry Sound, Ontario, on the shores of Georgian Bay, in November 1953. Fleming had been hunting partridges, Fuller wrote, and his body was found with a shotgun wound in the left breast, lying against boulders in the $30 Rapid in the Magnetawan River. Discovery was made by members of a family search party led by the widow, following instruction of a clairvoyant. The widow's sister reported that the clairvoyant had told her 3 different times that the missing man would be found dead in the water. Another clairvoyant had told a relative that Dr. Fleming's body would be found dead of a gunshot wound, and that he was even lying, clutching his chest. Thanks for watching. Before you go, I'm very pleased to announce that I'm finally selling signed copies of my books on mysteriesofcanada.com. If you'd like to check out my brand new e-store, please head on over to the website, link in description, and click the bookstore link in the top menu. Beneath the Amazon links, you'll find signed copies of most of my books. I'm also selling my Métis fiddling CD, Lost Tunes of Rupert's Land, of which there's a limited quantity, as well as a little hand-carved totem pole made from elm. Prices are listed in Canadian dollars, and if you add enough to your cart, you'll get free shipping. If you'd like to do some shopping and support my work in the process, please feel free to check out the link in the description.